I'm Ryan. I'm the Chief Technical Advisor for Collapse Survivor and the host of this post-simulation Lessons Learned podcast. We have two subject matter experts today, Larry, who has worked with the NSA and is a cybersecurity expert, and Colonel Miller, who is also a survival expert and also very knowledgeable about blockchain and cryptocurrency. The purpose of this podcast is to review the collapse threats and the key lessons learned on preparedness from this cyber attack of our financial system scenario and simulation. We will also discuss the destruction of Bitcoin, but the major collapse threat was the cyber attack on the financial system rather than the destruction of Bitcoin.
Some elements of the National Security Agency NSA cryptography were used to develop the Bitcoin blockchain. And there is speculation, such as the article you see here that I wrote several years ago, that Satoshi Nakamoto, the creator of Bitcoin, was probably an NSA employee or a contractor. I believe that for reasons explained in the article I won't get into in detail here. But basically, I think this is reasonable because he had expertise on cryptography he could have gotten from NSA. And the fact that he or she or they is not known is explained by the fact that if he was working for the NSA or a contractor there, it would have been illegal for him to be working on Bitcoin. So that would explain why his or her or their identity is secret. Bitcoin, as most of you know, has been popular as a means of avoiding government discovery of what you're buying. So black market drugs and worse have been purchased using Bitcoin. And some hackers, including North Korea, use Bitcoin as a means for their victims to pay ransom to recover data. So that was the reason why in this scenario, the NSA took down the Bitcoin blockchain, though there was also a hint that this was done because the government just doesn't like Bitcoin or any cryptocurrency that competes with the dollar. I should point out that Fortitude Ranch does have a cryptocurrency, the Fortitude token, which uses the Ethereum blockchain, and it's a utility token, meaning that it has real value in use. You can use Fortitude tokens to purchase membership in Fortitude Ranch. So in this simulation, what happened was the National Security Agency, NSA, destroyed the Bitcoin blockchain by first bringing up thousands of computers to compete in the process of solving the calculation and adding the next link in the Bitcoin blockchain. That's legal and okay to do. But what NSA also did is they engaged in computer network attack. They went after the big Bitcoin mining farms that have hundreds of computers, and they basically disabled them. So at that point, NSA had all the computers running on the Bitcoin blockchain, and they were then able to roll it back, remove past blocks to take them away from North Korea, and basically pervert and destroy the Bitcoin blockchain. So they couldn't do this in a fair competition, but they could do it with computer network attack.
So there were some other developments on crypto and blockchain in this scenario, but the major collapse threat was the cyber attacks on the banking system. That we'll turn to now.
Financial crises are not uncommon and may have multiple causes. Some examples of financial events resulting in catastrophic economic effects: the Amsterdam banking crisis in 1763, the Great Depression in 1929, which ran all the way up to 1939, the OPEC oil price shock of 1973, the Great Recession of 2008, the Great Lockdown or the COVID-19 recession. Something to remember is that we now live in a global economy, whether we like it or not. And industrialized countries and the financial world, all those components, banks, payment systems, stock markets, data, etc., they're all digitized. And as a result, are very connected and they're dependent upon each other. Another definition when we're thinking about economic collapse, an economic collapse is basically a breakdown of the national, regional, or territorial economy that typically follows a time of crisis. So an economic collapse occurs at the onset of a severe version of an economic contraction, a depression, or a recession, and this can last up to many years.
If you look at the causes of World War II, historians blame the Great Depression, the economic hardship that Germany faced as a result of the Versailles settlement after World War I and the reparations. And economic hardships can cause extreme political unrest, that's what you saw in Germany, that can result in rapid political change and possibly violence.
A key takeaway from that is an economic collapse. It's not part of the regular economic cycle of expansion and contraction. An economic collapse is most clearly identified by a widespread breakdown in normal market mechanisms and commerce.
Mhm. And that can lead to strikes and violence that can get out of control. And we've seen this in our history. People don't really remember it well, but in the Great Depression, there was a big march of World War I veterans, pensioners. They marched on Washington, D.C., kind of threatened Congress and the Supreme Court to basically say, hey, we want you to pay our pensions in advance, tens of thousands of them. And they didn't cause a lot of direct violence, but they scared people so much so that the army was called up to actually disperse them. And today, when you look at our society compared to back then, we tend to be a lot more violent. And a big march today would likely end up in massive looting and far worse violence than what we saw back in the Great Depression.
So in this slide, there goes the neighborhood. So as long as there's a currency and we could add people and greed to that equation, these kind of events could happen. As you're looking at the numbers and the data, it shows we're heading for a potential disaster. From a series of high-profile banks going bust to record inflation combined with major supply chain shortages, our economy seems to be heading right off the cliff.
The world, especially in the United States, is drowning in debt. But it's not just the government. People are borrowing at record levels as well.
Yeah, if you were to factor in unfunded liabilities like the Social Security shortfalls, Medicare, government pension plans, Obamacare, and the true debt number is way beyond what's listed there. Some people estimate that our real debt is somewhere between 222 trillion to 250 trillion dollars.
We've had some big bank failures recently. One example, the Silicon Valley bank collapse. But some experts actually warn that any day you could have a stock and crypto market crash. Commercial real estate market could crash again, collapse totally. Food shortages, U.S. inflation, any one of these could trigger a collapse event.
Yeah, and not necessarily because it's a rational response or something you could predict or expect. Could be something that's very irrational and unpredictable, like some economic disaster that a political candidate blames on the other party. Protests start, violence and looting starts, and then there's pent up anger, fears, and things just erupt, and you've got a huge breakdown in society and a loss of law and order.
And as Drew just mentioned, decision making by people during an economic collapse is not necessarily based on rational response on their part. It is definitely and is proven in studies based on raw emotions, especially when you take into account larger groups. So when we see panic in a larger group, you're looking at bank runs associated with chaos and violence on the streets. That's where the real fear steps in. So here, in this simulation, it was a cyber attack with the financial system as its primary target. And a cyber attack of the US banking system could result in bank runs, panic, and defaults across the country. Cybersecurity threats are evolving rapidly, which makes it very hard to defend. It's more reactive, with nation states involved in this, like Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, targeting specific industries, including banking. Good example, Ukraine's banking system was one of Russia's primary cyber targets. And the collapse of just one bank could trigger a domino effect, leading to collapse of hundreds of other institutions, affecting millions of people very rapidly with a devastating impact. The threat faced by the banking industry is not unique. All businesses face the risk of cyber attacks in this modern digital age.
So, so preparing for an economic collapse, should be a vital part of your survival plan, especially in today's world where our economy is so interdependent and where things can happen so rationally and get out of control. The ripple effects, and the violence that starts, the looting, the protests can get out of control, and it could die down, or it could do just the opposite. It could spread across the U.S. We saw that in the UK in 2011, and it can happen. And if it does, it could last quite a long time.
So when an economic collapse is either starting or the public fears there's one that's going to begin, you should start to expect to see quite rapidly a run on banks, maybe within hours. People are going to panic, And they'll do that whenever they'll do anything basically to get their hands on cash to buy extra supplies. That is, except for the group of people who, in what I think is good common sense, had a survival plan already in place.
Once the banks run dry, people will turn desperate. The second they realize that money is gone, and the moment you will see widespread chaos sweep throughout the country. Riots, looting, widespread violence will break out, making self-defense one of your primary concerns.
If this does happen, it's probably too late to think about preparing and getting your supplies now. If you try to make a trip to the store when there's looting or loss of law and order, you're going to be exposed to violence. There's a good chance of that, possibly injury and possibly even death.
This was mentioned in the simulation, with news covering coordinated flash mobs attacks in multiple large cities. It started with violence over the NSA taking down Bitcoin blockchain and the White House talking of digital currency that some will violently oppose.
So this collapse was not a very severe one, nothing compared to H5N1 or some of the others we've had. It was just a level 2 collapse, meaning there was some economic slowdown and uptick in looting, but not something where you really felt like you had a need to bug out.
And unless you live in a downtown area or in a place that's just prone to major protests.
Yeah, there things could have been really bad for you in this kind of a scenario.
Yeah, and some people think it's really exciting to live in a high-rise downtown condo in a major city. Right up front, it does look cool, but there is a real security risk from that kind of living in a place that basically is a magnet for protests that could quickly turn into an opportunity of looting and violence.
So the three major collapse survival lessons learned from this simulation were fairly simple. Number one is the most obvious. You need to talk to your family and kids and relatives and stress them to be aware of local protests going on, and don't regard them as something might be fun to, go and see or participate in, unless they're willing to accept the risk that those things can turn into looting and get violent pretty fast. And we've seen that in recent years in the United States. Not because the protesters are bad, but because gang members and opportunistic bad people use a protest. It could be an election event protest that has counter demonstrations as an excuse to start looting. That's what we saw in our Civil War simulation.
And that's correct. Bad guys especially, they know that the police are already expended in crowd control to keep protesters separated. And with thousands of people around, a group of 20 start looting, the police can't even get to them, let alone identify them. It's a great opportunity for bad people to loot.
Yeah. So the second key lesson from this scenario is to have some plan to deal with a run on banks or a cyber attack that takes banks down like we had in this scenario.
And that could mean just keeping several $100s of cash on hand in case the ATMs and the bank shut down.
Though being careful if rushing to the store that it's not an area of looting or panic.
Yeah. And the other key thing is, cash probably isn't going to be that useful in a collapse. You need to be able to barter and know how to do that. And that's kind of the major kind of deep dive survival lesson we want to talk about now in this particular simulation. So I'm going to switch to kind of blow up the slide. I realize this is hard to read. I'll blow it up a little bit more here in a second. But basically, this on the column on the rows there, you see a lot of different barter items that you might think of, some you might not have thought of. But what is the best item? Is it gold coins? Is it ammunition? How do you decide? There's a lot of things to consider, a lot of criteria. And that's why we use this multi-criteria decision analysis tool shown here. I know it looks fairly complicated. I'm going to walk through, and it's actually not that difficult. We use this multi-criteria decision analysis in a lot of our corporate collapse survival consulting that we do, because it's a really, really good way to understand the issues and the trade-offs you've got to make. So I've kind of blown it up here. Across the top, you can see the criteria we're using to figure out what is the best barter items to have. The first and most important thing is, what's the value of this item in a collapse? So on the top level, we had three things: the collapse value, the storage ease, and then the cost of getting this barter item. And I put more weight, a 3 weight on the collapse value, a lower weight of 2 on storage, and only a weight of 1 on the cost. I broke down collapse value into its value for trade, for barter, And then also its value for use if I'm going to use the product. And that's kind of a key principle. Barter items overall, they're best if they're things you actually need in a collapse. It's more useful to you because you may not have a chance to barter, and it's going to be more useful in trade and bartering, fairly obviously. Storage, we broke down into a lot of factors. Safety, storing gasoline can be fairly risky. It's a good barter item maybe, but you have to consider the safety of it, the upkeep work on it. Is there maintenance required? Is it something you can transport? Odds are the barter meetup isn't going to be in your backyard, so you may have to travel blocks, potentially miles. So transportation is something to consider when you're considering what's good for barter. And then finally is volume. I mean, if you got food, that takes up a lot more room than ammunition. And then finally the cost there. So we've rank ordered and rated a lot of them, and what came up number one for our values, and I'm largely here telling you values from Fortitude Ranch from our perspective, seeds was the number one item where we came up with. Very valuable for produce food. Most people are going to die of starvation in most collapse scenarios. Very low cost, easy to store, doesn't take up a lot of volume. So that's kind of how that ranks so highly. Vitamins was number 2. Ammunition came in at number 3. SS is shelf stable. Shelf stable food was there. And then antibiotics came up as another really highly desirable barter item.
So Larry, if I were to choose to barter with somebody, how should I do it? I want to stress I don't show your stockpile storage space and have barter items readily available.
Well, I'll answer that, and I think the best way to answer that is for me to put that in the lessons learned report, or rather than trying to go through here live, because there's a lot of things to consider. You could a barter meetup could be an opportunity for marauders who hear about it to ambush people coming and going. So that's a good thing to be concerned about, and I think we'll address that in the lessons learned report. So let me continue with some other barter items here. You don't see the top of it, but the top of it where I'm showing you the criteria, but whiskey came up next. Whiskey is actually good, not just because people want it. What's the value and uses? You could not drink. You'll still want whiskey in a collapse as an antiseptic if you've got to do a minor operation, clean a wound, that kind of thing. Then there's LED flashlights, a cheap 12-gauge pump shotgun, matches, batteries, chickens. Obviously, there's some difficulty in maintaining them and keeping them going compared to other things, but they're so valuable to have as a food source. And then gasoline ranked low, paper currency did not rank very well, and then gold coins we did not rate well. Now, again, this is based on our opinions and assessment of the criteria we showed you earlier. Different people have different views. Different regions will have different views. Seeds may not be of as much value to you if you're in an area where there's just not much of a planting season. So that was kind of the key points we want to make about barter. We'll have a bit more details in our lessons learned report. And then third collapse survival lesson learned from this slide, from this scenario, is that you have to be prepared before the collapse starts. You're not going to be able to go get cash when the banks are closed down, or beef up your barter items or other things when the collapse is started. You need to be prepared, obviously, before the shit hits the fan, is the prepper term we use.
Yeah. So, and there'll probably be no warning when a cyber attack starts, or it may be something that blends in with other normal news items. But I can pretty much guarantee you that if there is a cyber attack on the financial system, the banking system specifically, they're probably closing down as well as the ATMs before you even, if you've heard it on the news, it's already happened. So, in this scenario, things evolve fairly slowly. The banks could get taken down in hours. That means no credit cards are operating. Even if you get to a store with cash, they may be shutting down. Listen to the news. Try and stay situationally aware, and pay attention to threat updates that come out of Fortitude Ranch. Is kind of my thoughts on that.
And that's the major goal of the Collapse Survivor app, is to educate people on the need to prepare and how to prepare, so you can be best ready to for when the shit hits the fan. You guys will be emailed shortly a PDF report on lessons learned on this from the simulation. We've discussed some of them already, but in short, reminder that the Collapse Survivor app is not just for simulations, but real threats. We did issue one last week on the H5N1 virus, which is continuing to spread into more mammal populations.
And also to a human last week.
Yeah, and experts are warning that H5N1 in mammals is eventually going to evolve into a human-human transmissible form of the virus. But the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, after these reports came out and people were getting alarmed, they again said, "Oh, this is a low risk. Don't worry about it." And that's we think that's very wrong. H5N1 is getting closer and closer to human-human transmissible, but that's what you would expect from the government. They want people to be calm. They want them not to panic. They want them to trust the government's got everything taken care of. And we don't believe it. I don't think most preppers do believe that. But if you want to get warnings, you're going to get them from the Collapse Survivor app a lot faster than you will from the government, because they're not going to issue an alert until the disaster has already happened.
Which is why you need warnings from this app, because the public warnings may be delayed for political correctness or to avoid panicking people, which is kind of scary. The hours or days of the extra threat warning you could get from this app could save your life. We are running too late to do prepper humor this week. A lot to cover on the cyber threats and the Barter analysis. And this was not a bad collapse scenario. With even though there was a lot of discussion, a lot of things to think about, there's definitely the potential for millions of deaths and disaster. But we do normally like to include prepper jokes. So if you got some good ones, email to the address shown above, or go to this go to our website and go to contact us. This scenario has played out live over 6 days. It will now go into the app scenario library, and you can play it anytime with no pauses. You can flip through the screens as fast as you would like. We hope to see you next week for another scenario and survival preparedness lessons learned podcast. Until then, be prepared.
And from me, no negative waves. Stay positive.
Prepare for the worst, enjoy the present.